So in my last video, I tried to recreate Roger Deakins' color profile. Now it's kind of an impossible thing to do, knowing that he has a DIT on set that's helping him walk through color and pipe through it a lot for him and change things on the day, but I was just trying to make something that that could kind of get close to his color and look, just right in camera, just put it in your monitor and just be able to shoot with that so you have really nice color on set, and then you can really see your lighting ratios within your lighting. So after like kind of deep diving into Roger Deakins' work, I was watching a lot of his films, obviously. Wait for the truck to go by. I'm using a new mic today. I'm using the Rode Go with the lavalier, trying to see what that'll be like, so maybe I can be more mobile around my apartment as I shoot. So let me know how it sounds. Like I said, so after kind of diving into his films, notice that he does a lot of stuff differently than a lot of other DPs that you'll see in kind of modern Hollywood. First off, you'll notice he likes to shoot on Arri Master Primes on the Arri Alexa. Now the Master Primes are really nice lenses. I mean, they're like one of the most expensive lenses you can get, basically. And it's because they have really pleasing look and they're sharp wide open. Now I talk a lot on this channel about using vintage lenses and how they have a lot of character to them. And so when you're shooting, it's gonna give you a more unique look than maybe using a DSLR lens. It's gonna be a little bit more crisp for photography. But Roger doesn't do that. Like, these lenses are not old lenses. I mean, sure, they were designed a little bit ago, but they're designed to be very color accurate and very pleasing to the eye. And there's not any extra characteristics really going on in those. They actually have a pretty wide aperture on them, but if you notice, Roger Deakins doesn't actually shoot that wide open. He usually tends to shoot a little bit more closed down, to have more depth in his shots, which is very uncommon in today's standards. You'll see a lot of movies now. Not like I've talked about Bradford Young before on the channel, and he shoots wide open on like super speeds and stuff like that. And that's kind of like the new look, and it's something that I like a lot too. You know, Roger seems to be looking for a little bit more depth and a little bit more sharpness to his images. And when I was recreating the scenes in the last video, I noticed, you know, I've recreated a few of his scenes on the channel before. He's using somewhere around like a 21mm to a 35-40mm on most shots. But you know, he has to use like a 21, 24, 25mm quite often for like his medium shots or in his wide shots, because when he's cropping to 240, he's not gonna be able to get enough in the frame and still be kind of close to the subject otherwise. Now that could be a technological limitation, you know, shooting on a super 35mm sensor and he's cropping to 240 rather than using an anamorphic lens to get that widescreen aspect ratio. You're obviously gonna have to shoot on a wider lens to get that kind of same field of view that he's looking for, which is kind of interesting because he's actually never shot on a full frame camera until 1917 when he shot on the Alexa LF for a lot of it, and I think there's some of it is still on the Alexa Mini. But that's kind of interesting to me because as someone that has access to the LF or the 65 for some time now, he hasn't chose to shoot on that camera. He still chose to shoot on like an Alexa XT. Even Blade Runner, which was the original Blade Runner, was shot anamorphically, he still chose to shoot on a crop super 35mm sensor with Master Primes for Blade Runner 2049. So you know, I'm always talking on this channel about how I'm always on the hunt for a new full frame camera, and I've been looking at a lot of those. But maybe full frame isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Now obviously a lot of people on the internet have talked about this, but I'm going to talk about it in a little bit different angle. Let's talk about how you practically can shoot on a full frame camera versus practically shooting on a super 35mm camera, and the kind of the limitations between the two and what kind of image you'll actually get out of the two in different scenarios. Now I'm not going to do just a direct side-by-side comparison. I'm actually going to shoot a couple things and kind of show you why you may not want to use full frame sometimes and why you might want to use full frame sometimes. Because maybe Roger Deakins is onto something, and maybe having a little bit more depth and a little bit more sharpness to your image would be nice when you're trying to tell a narrative story. You can actually see your character fully in focus. You can see their skin and their eyes nice and sharp. And you can also see some stuff in the background that might help better tell your story. You know, using the shallow depth of field is really just a storytelling technique. But of course it can make things look pretty, but also sometimes you want to have a deeper focus to be able to see what's going on in the background. So just to get like a perspective on everything, let's just set up two cameras. I'll shoot with a few different lenses here, and we'll kind of try to match them as far as a full frame look versus the super 35mm look. So first we're going to use the XT3 with the Viltrox speed booster, which I've talked about on the channel before. So that's going to make this sensor's perspective actually be about a 1.1 crop. So not quite full frame, but really close compared to a super 35mm camera, which would be about a 1.5 if we were on the XT3. And we're going to compare that to my Blackmagic Ursa Mini 4.6K, which is also around a 1.5 super 35mm crop. So kind of my go-to lens for a super 35mm camera is a 35mm lens. It's a very versatile focal length for me. I feel like it's good for close-ups and good for backing up to get mediums and even wide shots if need be. So let's try to work around that constraint first. So here's what the 35mm at f2 looks like on the Ursa Mini. Now, if we wanted to get a similar field of view, we would have to put on the 55mm on the XT3 on the full frame camera, and we're gonna have to stop down that lens somewhere around f4 to get a similar look. And if you look at these, the bokeh, you know, based on what I can tell here, the bokeh looks pretty similar. You can tell the little circles in the background look very similar. And that could be because my lens, my 55mm, has a really nice diaphragm inside of it. The actual aperture blades, there's quite a few aperture blades, and so when it stops down and gets wider, it has a smooth oval shape. But a lot of lenses don't have that. A lot of lenses have less aperture blades, and when you start to stop down, they are going to get more jagged edges. You're going to get less pleasing bokeh in the background, which is something to think about. Because if we're on a full frame camera and everything's kind of out of focus, and so we want to stop down the lens to get more in focus, well, then you're going to change the bokeh in the background. First, when you're shooting on Super 35, you can probably open up your lens all the way and not have that problem because you're farther away from the subject in order to get the same frame size. Okay, so let's just slide and look at all these kind of side by side and see how they look. That way we can have something to compare it to going forward. What actually looks better? Right now we're on the XC3 with the 35mm f2, so we're on the crop sensor, and you can sort of see, you know, the soft edges behind me. There's a little bit of shallow depth of field going on here, which I'm separated from the background. But let's throw on the full frame and see how that looks in the exact same scenario and with the exact same framing. Okay, so I've put on the Viltrox Speed Booster and the 55mm f2. That should be somewhat in focus around here. So that's similar framing, not quite perfect because I had to tilt the camera up a little bit to kind of get it in the same area, but you can obviously see that the compression has changed. Now we can see more of the camera over the shoulder now. Maybe that's just because we're a little higher. But so that's at f2, so there should be a much more shallow depth of field there. So let's compare that. Now let's stop this down to f4 so it matches more of the 35mm at f2 and see what that looks like as well. So let's stop this down, going down to f4. Okay, focus should be pretty much close to the same there. Should be in focus maybe here. Now let's brighten this up in post. Bloop. Now let's see what that looks like. So that should be much more accurate from a depth of field standpoint. Do you feel like there's any loss of quality on the lens that way? Now obviously these are two different types of lenses, so they're gonna look different either way, but do you see any loss of quality? Do you see anything that's like standing out as like not wanting to shoot with the full frame versus shooting with Super 35mm in this instance? Obviously the biggest downside is that on the 35mm f2 that we're using for the comparison, obviously it just stops at f2. If it could go to 1.4 or 1.2, we could probably get a more shallow depth of field and get it even closer looking to the full frame. But the full frame has even more room to grow because at 1.2, you're gonna get way more shallow depth of field than you would at a 1.2 on the Super 35. And when I'm saying this, I mean, now you're only gonna get a more shallow depth of field if you try to get the same frame size. Obviously, if two cameras were right by each other, and they were both at the same aperture, they would have the same depth of field. But if you're trying to get the subject frame the same, you're gonna have to back up the Super 35mm camera to get the subject in the same frame. And the farther you get away from the subject, obviously your depth of field is going to grow. So keep that in mind when we're talking about these comparisons. Now, I don't think I've made a conclusive argument yet other than I just prefer the full frame look and I have the ability to stop down if I need to, but I just wanna make sure that I'm not sacrificing anything when I do that. Now where things start to get a little bit tricky is when you're filming like a close-up like this and you want to get both eyes in focus. You know, we're sort of at like a 45-degree angle here if I'm looking off over here at the window. And right now we're on the Fujifilm at the, let's see, we're on a 35mm f. We're at f2. You'll notice if I look off like this, most likely both eyes are probably in focus at this distance. We're just a few feet from the camera with a 35 at f2, so we have a little bit of depth of field going on here. We actually have enough in focus to be able to get both of my eyes in focus. Which is good, because a lot of what an actor is doing is they're acting through their eyes, or telling emotions through their eyes. So in a lot of ways you want both eyes in focus so you can see all of that emotion coming through with the actor. So let's put on the speed booster and the 55mm lens to get a similar frame size and see if both eyes will be in focus at f2 like this 35mm at f2. Now I had to back up the camera just maybe less than a foot just to kind of get a similar frame size, which is obviously going to add some more depth of field to the image, so maybe both of my eyes are in focus. I'm not sure yet, but my guess is that one is definitely going to go soft. Okay, so now here's the same shot, but now I'm at f4 on the 55mm, just to give ourselves a little bit of depth of field back. So this is something that's kind of cool about full frame, is that you still have the option to stop down and get back to a territory where more is in focus. And then you have the ability to open back up if you are trying to have a really shallow depth of field. Because if you notice in the last shot, the bokeh over here outside the window looks really awesome. And now it doesn't look bad at all right now, it still looks pretty good, but we definitely have a different look going on now. But that being said, do you think that the 35mm at f2 is more pleasing than the 55mm at f4, or vice versa? Well, like I said before, of course you'd get a 35mm that would go up, like go to f1.2 or f1.4, and then you'll be able to open the lens even farther, but you're still not going to have as big of a range as you would with the full frame cameras. Now on this lens, on the 55mm, I know it goes to f1.2, but f1.2, basically nothing is in focus anyways, so that's why I try to shoot with this lens at f2. It's just a lot sharper at f2 and just more manageable, and that's something to think about when you're using a lens at f1.2 anyways. It's just kind of ridiculous and almost pointless to even use that unless you're trying to go for a really unique dreamlike feel. So where does that leave us in all this? I mean, which sensor size is the better one to choose? I don't think there's a perfect answer for this for sure. I think it just depends on what you can afford, what kind of camera you can get a hold of, and which one is the best for the gig, for the job, for the film, for whatever you're shooting. You know, we've been shooting on the super 35mm sensor for a really long time, and the full frame is really just a new possibility. It's a new way of shooting. There's gonna be a little bit of a learning curve when shooting on the full frame sensors. Of course, people have been shooting on like Sony's and Canon 5D Mark IIs and stuff like that for a while now, but full frame cinema isn't something that's been happening a lot. It's coming around more now, and we've talked about it a lot on this channel before, but there's definitely going to be some trade-offs with shooting on the full frame sensor, but also there's going to be some trade-offs when shooting on the Super 35, and you just have to decide which one works for you. Now, if you look at like someone like David Fincher, you know, he shoots on the wider sensors, 6K, 8K, and then he crops in really deep on those sensors, so he has a lot of room to reframe in post. So he's using the sensor size for a totally different reason. You know, he tends to shoot on kind of wider angle lenses, so he can crop in even farther, and you know, he's gonna have a lot more in focus. You know, but he's trying to tell stories, he needs a little bit more in focus to tell the story. But then you look at someone like Emmanuel Lubezki, Chivo, who is shooting something like The Revenant on the Alexa 65, which the Alexa 65 is a 65mm wide sensor. We're talking a super wide sensor, which is gonna give you really shallow depth of field, and you can get close to your subject. But he used really wide angle lenses at like f16 when he did that. He wanted a really immersive experience. So he was using the sensor size for another totally different reason. You know, I have friends that shoot on micro four thirds, Patrick Tomaso, I'm looking at you, and he gets really great images shooting wide open on like a 25mm lens. So we definitely don't want to get into a big debate over sensor size here. You really just need to figure out which works best for you. I tend to like the full frame look because it's really unique and it's not something that we've seen a lot of, and that's just really appealing to me. Now, it's not always going to work because, like I said, some things are just going to be out of focus. And you also have to think about the focus pooler if you're on a professional set and you're doing something like, you know, like when Christopher Nolan shot like The Dark Knight or like Interstellar, and he's shooting on the 65mm camera. If he's shooting wide open, your depth of field is razor thin and you may not have anything in focus, and that's something that's not going to be really easy for you if you're doing something by yourself and you don't even have a focus puller. And even if you do have a focus puller, it's going to make it really difficult for them. But you know, great sacrifice comes a really nice image. So if you like the full frame look, then do what you can to get it. Now this all started because we were talking about Roger Deakins. Now he's only shot 1917 on a full frame camera, and you know, all of his other movies look amazing. Oh, and by the way, I've been coloring this whole video with the Roger Deakins recreation LUT that I did on the last video. If you want to try out that LUT, you can get that in the description below. Now I think there's an argument for both sensor sizes, but I just think it's really fun to be able to explore different sensor sizes and what they do, and it's just kind of what I was trying to show off here today. And if you want to see more stuff like this, actually pretty soon here I'm going to have the Zcam F6 in for review. I'm going to test that out. That's another full frame camera that actually shoots RAW 12-bit. I'm really excited about that. If you want to see stuff like that, definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you can see that in the future. So let me know if you like this kind of series that I'm doing right now, where I'm kind of going a little deeper into filmmaking and talking less about the basics and more about the nuance of it. If you like stuff like this, let me know in the comments below if this is something that you want to keep seeing, and I'll try to keep creating stuff like this on the channel. Well, I think that's going to wrap up this video. Like I said before, definitely give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe if you loved it. And until next time, guys, I'm Spencer Sakurai. See ya.